On October 19, 1897, George Mortimer Pullman died in his Prairie Avenue mansion. He left behind a railroad empire that controlled overnight travel across America. He also left behind a neighbor he had loathed for 10 years, a fortress. Blank granite walls facing the street, no windows on the first floor. Built between 1885 and 1887 by a farm equipment manufacturer who had deliberately rejected every principle of Victorian architecture. The house sat at 1800 South Prairie Avenue, directly across from Pullman's ornate chateau. The architect had designed it that way. Pullman called it that thing. He told visitors he did not know what he had done to have that thing staring him in the face every time he went out of his door. Pullman was the sleeping car magnate who had revolutionized rail travel. He employed 14,000 workers in a company town where he owned every building, every utility line, every blade of grass. Those workers earned $9.07 every 2 weeks before rent was deducted. After Pullman took his cut, they had 7 cents left to feed their families. Some called him a visionary who brought luxury to the masses. Others saw a despot who built an empire on wage theft. The fortress represented architectural rebellion at its peak, but Prairie Avenue carried darker secrets about labor violence and class warfare that ended only when one combatant died hated by thousands. If you are fascinated by Gilded Age mansions built to humiliate millionaire neighbors and the labor-violent Chicago's elite never mention in their house tours, subscribe. Tell me in the comments which robber baron rivalry we should investigate next. Now let's discover how a farm equipment salesman built a fortress to insult the most hated man in Chicago. Chapter 1. The Salesman Who Became a Vice President. John Jacob Glessner was born on November 3, 1843 in Zanesville, Ohio. His father ran a hardware store. His mother managed the household. The family had no fortune. Young Glessner understood early that wealth would not arrive through inheritance. His father sold tools and hardware to farmers and tradesmen. The work was respectable. It was not lucrative. The family had connections to farm machinery manufacturing through business relationships in Ohio. By his early 20s, Glessner had joined Warder, Bushnell and Glessner, a firm that produced harvesting equipment in Springfield, Ohio. The company name included his surname. He was not a founder. He was a partner brought in to manage sales and distribution. The firm manufactured Champion reapers and mowers. These machines competed directly with Cyrus McCormick's operation in Chicago. The competition was fierce. Agricultural equipment was transforming American farming. Mechanical harvesters meant fewer workers needed per acre. Farmers who bought the machines survived. Those who didn't fell behind. Glessner learned the business from the ground up. He understood that farmers needed credit. Most couldn't pay cash for $100. Reaper. The dealers who offered installment plans captured the market. Glessner built relationships with implement dealers across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. He traveled constantly. He learned which dealers paid their bills and which went bankrupt, owing the company money. In 1870, John Glessner married Frances Macbeth. She came from a family with more social standing than the Glessners possessed. Her father had been a businessman in Springfield. The marriage brought legitimacy. It also brought expectations about the life they would build together. Immediately after the wedding, Glessner relocated to Chicago. The firm needed someone to open a branch office in the city that was becoming the center of American agriculture and manufacturing. Glessner accepted the assignment. He moved west with his new wife and no guarantees about success. Chicago in 1870 was a city rebuilding itself. The Great Fire of 1871 would come the following year, but even before the disaster, Chicago was expanding rapidly. Railroads converged on the city. Stockyards processed meat for the entire country. Farm equipment manufacturers needed access to the farmers who bought their machines and the railroads that shipped them. Glessner opened the Chicago office at 112 Michigan Avenue. The location put him close to the financial district and the railroad depots. He rented modest office space. The company couldn't afford anything elaborate. His job was to generate sales that would justify better quarters later. He sold harvesting equipment to farmers across Illinois, Iowa, and Indiana. He traveled constantly by rail. He learned the agricultural markets. He understood credit terms that allowed farmers to buy machinery they could not afford in cash. He negotiated with dealers who wanted exclusive territories. He settled disputes about defective machines. The work was exhausting. The Glessners lived first in rented rooms, then in a small house on West Washington Street. It was a comfortable middle-class neighborhood. Nothing grand. Frances described their home as cozy. She valued warmth and privacy over display. They had 2 children. George was born in 1875. Frances Eleanor in 1876. The house on Washington Street suited a young family. The work was not glamorous. It was profitable. By 1880, Glessner was a full partner in Warder, Bushnell, and Glessner. The firm produced reapers, mowers, and binders. The equipment allowed farmers to harvest crops with fewer workers. The machines were good. The distribution network was better. Glessner had built relationships with dealers across the Midwest. He was making money. He was not yet wealthy by Chicago standards. The city's true elite lived on Prairie Avenue on the near South Side. Marshall Field owned a mansion there. So did George Pullman, Philip Armour, William Wallace Kimball, John Sherman. The street was called the Sunny Street that held the sifted few. These men controlled industries at national scale. Field ran department stores. Pullman manufactured railroad cars. Armour processed meat. Their wealth exceeded anything farm equipment sales could generate. Glessner belonged to a different category. He was successful. He was not a magnate. That distinction changed in 1902. J.P. Morgan orchestrated a merger of 5 farm equipment manufacturers. Warder, Bushnell, and Glessner joined with firms controlled by Morgan, Cyrus McCormick, and James Deering. The new company was called International Harvester. It became the 4th largest corporation in the United States. Glessner was appointed vice president. He continued in that capacity for years. The position came with substantial compensation, stock holdings, board influence, the accumulated wealth that came from consolidating an entire industry. By 1885, 17 years before the merger, Glessner already had enough money to consider Prairie Avenue. The farm equipment business had been good to him. The Chicago office had grown from a one-man operation to a regional headquarters. His partnership stake had increased. He had savings. He had assets. He could afford the best residential address in Chicago. The neighborhood required more than wealth. It required conformity to certain expectations about architecture, social behavior, and display. The mansions on Prairie Avenue announced their owner's status through scale and ornament. French Second Empire style dominated. Elaborate facades, towers, decorative excess. The houses competed with each other in demonstrating how much their owners could afford to spend. Glessner and Frances had lived in Chicago for 15 years. They had raised their children in their Washington Street house. Frances described that house as cozy. She valued warmth and privacy over display. When they decided to build on Prairie Avenue, they wanted something different from what their neighbors built. They did not want a French chateau. They did not want Victorian ornamentation. They wanted a house that felt like a home rather than a monument. Glessner walked the neighborhood looking at available lots. He found property at 1800 South Prairie Avenue on the southwest corner of 18th Street. The lot was large, L-shaped. It sat directly across from George Pullman's mansion. That proximity didn't concern Glessner. He barely knew Pullman. They moved in different social circles despite living on the same street. Most of their prospective neighbors would have hired a Chicago architect. The city had talented designers: Solon Beeman, Daniel Burnham, John Van Osdell. These men understood what Prairie Avenue expected. The Glessners hired someone who understood nothing about Prairie Avenue expectations. Henry Hobson Richardson lived in Massachusetts. He was one of the most famous architects in America. He had designed Trinity Church in Boston, the Marshall Field Wholesale Store in Chicago, the Buffalo State Asylum in New York. His buildings were massive, powerful, and completely unlike the ornate Victorian architecture that dominated wealthy neighborhoods. Richardson worked in a style that became known as Richardsonian Romanesque: heavy stone walls, rough-cut granite, round arches, minimal ornamentation. The buildings looked medieval but functioned with modern efficiency. His houses rejected the Victorian principle that architecture should display wealth through decoration. Richardson believed architecture should create privacy and comfort. Exteriors could be fortress-like. Interiors could be warm. The outside world did not need to see how the family lived. This philosophy matched what the Glessners wanted. When Richardson visited their West Washington Street house in early 1885, he saw a photograph of outbuildings at Abingdon Abbey in England. The photograph showed simple stone structures with blank exterior walls and an interior courtyard. Richardson sketched a design almost immediately. The house would face Prairie Avenue with blank granite walls. No windows on the street side. The family rooms would open onto an interior courtyard that faced south. Servants' quarters would run along the north side, buffering the family spaces from street noise and Chicago's brutal winter winds. The design was radical. It was exactly what the Glessners requested. The house would cost approximately $100,000 for construction. The lot had already been purchased. The total investment would exceed what most Chicago families earned in a lifetime. Glessner had accumulated wealth through farm equipment sales and strategic business partnerships. He had not inherited money. He had not built a monopoly. He had worked his way into the partnership that would eventually become part of International Harvester. That background mattered. Old money conformed to expectations. New money sometimes challenged them. Glessner was new money with progressive ideas about architecture and domestic life. His neighbors would not approve. Glessner and Francis did not seem concerned about their neighbors' approval. They signed the contract with Richardson in May 1885. Construction would take more than 2 years. By the time they moved in, Prairie Avenue would understand exactly what the Glessners thought about conformity and display. The farm equipment salesman was building a house that would insult everyone around him. That outcome was not accidental. Chapter 2. The Haymarket Bombing. On May 4, 1886, someone threw a bomb into a crowd of policemen in Haymarket Square. 8 policemen died. At least 4 bystanders were killed. 5 labor leaders were hanged for the murders. 1 committed suicide in his cell. The violence did not begin on May 4th. It had been building for years. The economic crash of 1873 had devastated working families across America. In Chicago, unemployment surged. Wages dropped. Factory owners squeezed more productivity from fewer workers. Labor organizers responded by demanding an 8-hour workday. The standard was 12 hours, sometimes more. The Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions held its annual convention in Chicago in October 1884. The delegates set a deadline, May 1st, 1886. If employers did not grant the 8-hour day by that date, workers would walk off the job nationwide. Chicago's elite watched the labor movement with increasing alarm. Their mansions on Prairie Avenue sat blocks from factories and slaughterhouses where workers earned subsistence wages. The proximity was becoming uncomfortable. On Thanksgiving 1884, the local branch of the International Working People's Association organized a Poor People's March. Hundreds of workers paraded through the streets. The route was carefully chosen. It passed directly in front of the Prairie Avenue mansions. The march began at noon. Workers carried red flags. Some carried banners demanding an 8-hour day. Others demanded work or bread. The procession moved south from downtown, then turned onto Prairie Avenue. The marchers stopped in front of the homes of the wealthiest industrialists. They shouted at the families celebrating inside behind bolted doors. They sang labor songs. Some speeches were delivered from the sidewalk. The servants inside the mansions watched from upper windows. The owners stayed away from view. George Pullman was home that Thanksgiving. So were the Armours. So was Marshall Field. They heard the shouts. They heard the songs. They understood the message. Workers knew where the rich lived. Workers were watching. The march lasted 2 hours. Police monitored from a distance but did not intervene. No violence occurred. No property was damaged. The demonstration remained peaceful, but the threat was implicit. Hundreds of workers standing outside your home, angry about wages and working conditions, constituted intimidation, even without physical confrontation. 4 days later, on April 28, 1885, Chicago's business leaders held a grand banquet to celebrate the opening of the new Board of Trade building. The IWPA organized another parade to protest. Police redirected the march several blocks from the gala. The confrontation was avoided. The tension remained. Richardson met with the Glessners a few weeks after that protest. He saw the photograph of Abingdon Abbey. He sketched his initial design, the blank walls facing the street, the fortress appearance, the complete rejection of transparency. Some historians would later claim Richardson designed the house as protection against labor unrest, a fortress to shield the Glessner family from angry workers. The timeline proves otherwise. Richardson died on April 27, 1886. He was 47 years old. Bright's disease had been killing him for years. He left behind 17 unfinished commissions. Glessner House was among them. The essential design was complete. The firm of Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge would finish the construction. 1 week after Richardson's death, on May 1st, 1886, the 8-hour movement deadline arrived. Across Chicago, workers walked off their jobs. Approximately 40,000 people struck. The city's industrial production stopped. 3 days later, on May 4th, labor leaders called a protest meeting at Haymarket Square. The gathering was peaceful. Around 10:30 p.m., as the crowd was dispersing, someone threw a bomb into a formation of police officers. The explosion killed 1 officer instantly. 7 more died from injuries in the following days. Police opened fire on the crowd. At least 4 civilians were killed. The actual number was likely higher. Many wounded were carried away by fellow protesters and never counted. Authorities arrested 8 labor leaders: August Spies, Albert Parsons, Samuel Fielden, Michael Schwab, Adolf Fischer, George Engel, Louis Link, Oscar Neebe. The trial began on June 21st, 1886. It lasted until August 20th. The trial was a spectacle. The prosecution could not prove who threw the bomb. The physical evidence was thin. No witness testimony directly connected any of the defendants to the bombing. The prosecution argued conspiracy. The defendants had advocated violence in speeches and writings. They had encouraged workers to arm themselves. Therefore, they were responsible for any violence that occurred, even if they hadn't personally committed it. The jury convicted all 8. 7 were sentenced to death. 1 received 15 years in prison. 4 were hanged on November 11, 1887. Louis Link committed suicide in his cell the day before the execution. He lit a smuggled dynamite cap in his mouth. The 3 remaining death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. They were pardoned 6 years later. The evidence linked none of the defendants directly to the violence. The jury convicted them anyway. 2 weeks after the bombing, the Glessners signed the construction contract for their Prairie Avenue house. Work began in May 1886. The timing was not coincidental. The Haymarket bombing made blank walls and fortress architecture suddenly relevant in ways Richardson had never intended. But the design preceded the violence. Richardson's drawings from early 1885 showed the same blank granite walls, the same fortress appearance, the same rejection of street-facing windows. Haymarket did not inspire the design. Haymarket made the design seem prescient. The fortress myth served everyone's interests. The Glessners could claim their house was practical protection rather than architectural rebellion. Their neighbors could interpret the blank walls as reasonable precaution rather than deliberate insult. Historians could frame the design as response to labor unrest rather than aesthetic choice. The timeline reveals the truth. Richardson designed a fortress before workers bombed policemen. The blank walls faced George Pullman's windows long before labor violence made fortress architecture seem justified. The confusion benefited the Glessners. Their neighbors found the house less offensive when they believed it was protection rather than provocation. The architectural insult was easier to accept when it appeared to serve a defensive purpose. But the house was not designed to keep workers out. It was designed to keep neighbors at a distance. The walls faced Prairie Avenue, not the factories to the south and east. The blank granite confronted the Pullman mansion directly across the street. That placement was deliberate. Richardson knew exactly what he was doing. He was creating privacy. He was also creating offense. Chapter 3. The Architect Who Hated Ornament. Henry Hobson. Richardson was born on September 29, 1838 in Louisiana. He came from plantation wealth built on slave labor. The Civil War destroyed that fortune. Richardson rebuilt his life through architecture. He was the second American to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Richard Morris Hunt, who would design mansions for the Vanderbilts, had been the first. Richardson enrolled in 1860. The Civil War began while he was studying in France. His family's finances collapsed during the war. The plantation economy was destroyed. Confederate currency became worthless. Richardson's expected inheritance evaporated. He could not afford to complete his degree at the École. He stayed in Paris as long as possible, absorbing European architectural traditions while living on borrowed money and occasional work. He returned to America in 1865 with incomplete credentials and comprehensive training. Early work came slowly. Richardson designed in French country style because that was what he had studied. The buildings were competent. They were not distinctive. Clients were scarce. The post-war economy was disrupted. Few people were building. He married Julia Gorham Hayden in January 1867. The couple moved to Staten Island. Richardson opened an office in New York. He took whatever commissions he could find: churches, houses, small commercial buildings. Nothing brought him recognition. Richardson became friends with Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who was designing Central Park. Olmsted's philosophy influenced Richardson's thinking. Architecture should respond to site and function, not impose European templates on American landscapes. Buildings should grow from their surroundings. They should serve their inhabitants. Style should follow purpose. Olmsted was designing the grounds for the Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane. He recommended Richardson for the buildings. The commission came in 1870. It was Richardson's first major project. The asylum buildings introduced what would become Richardson's signature style: heavy stone walls, round arches, minimal decoration. The structures looked medieval but functioned with modern efficiency. The buildings were designed to be calming and therapeutic. No elaborate ornament to overstimulate patients. Simple, powerful forms that conveyed permanence and security. By 1870, Richardson was developing his own approach. He studied Romanesque architecture from medieval France and Spain. The style featured heavy stone walls, round arches, minimal decoration, massive scale. The buildings looked ancient, but could be adapted to modern needs. His breakthrough came with Trinity Church in Boston, designed between 1872 and 1877. The church was Romanesque, but not imitative. Richardson used the vocabulary of medieval architecture to create something entirely new: rough-cut stone, powerful massing, ornament restricted to capitals and arches. The tower dominated Copley Square. The interior felt both intimate and grand. The church made his reputation. Suddenly, every major city wanted a Richardson building. Commissions accelerated. Sever Hall at Harvard, Allegheny County Courthouse in Pittsburgh, the Ames Memorial Library in Northeaston, the Marshall Field Wholesale Store in Chicago. Each project refined his approach. The style became known as Richardsonian Romanesque. The Marshall Field Wholesale Store, completed in 1887, demonstrated Richardson's mature philosophy. 7 stories of red granite and sandstone, round arches marching across the facades, no applied ornament. The stonework itself created the decoration. The building was a fortress that announced commercial power through mass and materials rather than Victorian excess. Louis Sullivan called it a masterpiece. Frank Lloyd Wright studied it obsessively. The building influenced an entire generation of Chicago architects. Richardson had proven that American commercial architecture didn't need to imitate European palaces. It could be powerful, modern, and distinctly American. By 1885, Richardson was at the pinnacle of American architecture. When a trade magazine polled architects about the most important buildings in the country, 5 of the top 10 were Richardson's work: Trinity Church, the New York State Capitol in Albany, the Allegheny County Courthouse, Sever Hall, the Ames Memorial Library. He was also dying. Bright's disease had been ravaging his kidneys for years. He weighed over 300 pounds. His body was swelling with fluid his kidneys couldn't process. Walking was difficult. Climbing stairs was impossible. He worked from his bed in his Brookline, Massachusetts home. His office was set up in his bedroom. Assistants brought drawings. Clients came to his bedside. He supervised projects he would never see completed. The disease was incurable. Victorian medicine could do nothing for kidney failure. Richardson knew his time was limited. He worked faster. He accepted more commissions than he could properly supervise. He was racing against his own death. The Glessners approached him in early 1885. They wanted a house on Prairie Avenue that would be comfortable and private. They showed him their current home on West Washington Street. They described it as cozy. They wanted to preserve that feeling in a larger house on a prestigious street. Richardson saw the photograph of Abingdon Abbey. The image showed stone outbuildings with blank exterior walls surrounding a courtyard. The structures were utilitarian. They were also beautiful in their simplicity. He sketched a design almost immediately. The house would be pushed to the lot edges on Prairie Avenue and 18th Street, blank granite walls on those sides, an interior courtyard opening to the south. All family rooms facing the courtyard, a servants' corridor along the north side, buffering against street noise and winter winds. The design inverted Victorian residential architecture. Typical wealthy homes displayed their facades to the street. Elaborate entrances, large windows showing expensive interiors, architecture as advertisement of wealth. Richardson's design hid the family from the street. No ground floor windows on public sides. The entrance tucked into an archway. Everything turned inward toward the private courtyard. Architecture as barrier against public intrusion. The Glessners approved immediately. This was exactly what they wanted. Privacy over display, comfort over conformity. A house that functioned for family life rather than social. Performance. Richardson specified Braggville pink granite for the exterior walls. The stone came from quarries in Massachusetts. The color was warm, not cold. The walls would be 8 to 10 inches thick, faced over structural brick. Illinois dolomite for the foundation. The second-floor windows would have finely carved capitals. The entrance would feature an arch of stylized foliage. Ornamentation would be minimal. Richardson had moved beyond decorative excess. His mature style relied on massing and materials rather than applied ornament. The granite itself would be the decoration, the way light hit the rough-cut stone, the horizontal coursing creating rhythm across the facade. Inside, the design was equally radical. Rooms flowed together with informal fluidity. No grand staircase dominating an entrance hall. No suite of parlors for receiving visitors. The family spaces were interconnected and comfortable. Arts and crafts furnishings, William Morris wallpapers and textiles. Everything designed for use rather than display. Richardson's firm prepared detailed drawings through late 1885 and early 1886. Construction was scheduled to begin in spring 1886. Richardson would supervise from Boston. His health was deteriorating rapidly. He was bedridden now, except for brief periods when he could sit up to work. He continued designing from his bed. The Glessner house was one of his last projects. On April 27, 1886, Richardson died. He was 47 years old. The Glessner house was his last residential commission. His firm, reorganized as Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, under his former assistants, completed the construction following his plans. The essential design remained exactly as Richardson conceived it. Of all the houses Richardson designed, this was the one he said he would choose to live in himself. The fortress walls, the private courtyard, the rejection of architectural display, the comfort and warmth inside contrasting with the massive exterior. Richardson understood what the Glessners wanted because he wanted the same things: privacy, comfort, architecture that served the inhabitants rather than impressing the neighbors. He also understood what the design would do to Prairie Avenue. The blank walls would confront Victorian expectations. The fortress appearance would challenge the neighborhood's architectural consensus. Every mansion on the street announced its owner's wealth through ornament and scale. Richardson's design announced the Glessners' rejection of that entire system. The architect died before construction began. He never saw the granite walls rise from bedrock. He never witnessed the neighbors' reactions. He never heard George Pullman call it that thing. But Richardson knew what he was designing: a house that would be comfortable for the family, a house that would insult everyone else. Chapter 4. Walls that insulted. No windows on the street sides. The first floor was completely blind. Pedestrians walking past 1800 South Prairie Avenue saw only granite, rough-cut pink stone laid in horizontal courses, an entrance tucked into an archway, no transparency, no invitation, no acknowledgement that the street existed. This violated every principle of Victorian residential architecture. Wealthy homes were supposed to engage the street. Large windows displayed expensive interiors. Elaborate porches demonstrated hospitality. Architectural details announced refinement and taste. The facade was a public statement about private wealth. Richardson's design rejected that entire system. The walls pushed to the lot edges. The family rooms opened only to the interior courtyard. The street received blank granite and silence. Construction began in May 1886, 2 weeks after Richardson's death. Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge took over supervision. The firm sent a representative to Chicago to oversee the work. Construction foremen managed the crews. The Glessners visited the site frequently to monitor progress. Workers quarried Braggville pink, granite in Massachusetts, and shipped it to Chicago by rail. Each stone was cut to specification at the quarry. The pieces were numbered and marked for placement. Train cars loaded with granite left Massachusetts weekly. The rail journey took days. The stone arrived at Chicago freight yards. Wagons hauled it to the Prairie Avenue site. The foundation went down in Illinois dolomite. Workers dug down to bedrock. The foundation walls were 3 feet thick. Structural walls rose in common brick. The building's skeleton was traditional load-bearing masonry. The granite facing would be laid over the brick in courses of varying heights. The walls were 8 to 10 inches thick, not thick enough for true fortification, thick enough to create psychological mass. The rough-cut stone made the walls look heavier than they were. The horizontal coursing emphasized the building's length along Prairie Avenue and 18th Street. Each course was a different height, creating rhythm without repetition. The construction process was brutal. Chicago summers meant heat. Workers handled stone in temperatures exceeding 90 degrees. Sweat made granite slippery. Injuries occurred. Chicago winters made mortar freeze. Stone became difficult to work. Hands went numb. Construction slowed but never stopped completely. The entrance archway required special attention. The arch was a single piece of carved stone. It featured stylized foliage. The carving was done on site by a mason Richardson's firm brought from Boston. The work took weeks. The arch was lifted into place with block and tackle. It weighed over a ton. The second-floor windows had finely carved capitals. Each capital was unique. Richardson had designed them to be visible from the street. The first floor remained blind, but the upper windows announced that human beings lived inside. The capitals were evidence of care and craftsmanship. They distinguished the house from a purely utilitarian warehouse. Frances Glessner recorded the neighbors' reactions in her journal. She wrote down every comment she heard. The documentation was deliberate. She wanted to preserve the evidence of what the house provoked. The neighbors called it the fortress, the jail, the prison. Some said it looked odd. Others called it queer. One person described it as Dutch. Another said it reminded them of Spanish or Mexican architecture. No one seemed to know how to classify it. One neighbor stopped Frances on the street in September 1886. "What on earth are you building?" the woman asked. Frances explained it was their new home. The woman said it looked like a fortress. Frances replied that was intentional. They wanted privacy. The woman walked away shaking her head. Another neighbor sent a note. The message was polite but pointed. Prairie Avenue had architectural standards. The mansion shared a vocabulary of ornament and display. The Glessner house violated those standards. It would lower property values. It would make the street look odd. The Glessners should reconsider the design. Frances showed the note to John. They discussed it briefly. They proceeded with construction unchanged. The Chicago newspapers covered the construction. Journalists struggled to explain what Richardson and the Glessners were attempting. The Herald described the house as a radical departure from traditional design. The Tribune noted it would have no windows on the street fronts except on the second floor. The first floor would be lighted and ventilated from an interior court accessible through a gated archway. One article stated the design resembled dwellings in Spain and Mexico. Another suggested it was built in anticipation of the day when the rich would need to keep out anarchists and bloodthirsty individuals who believed in property division. But the writer acknowledged the real object was privacy and novelty. George Pullman's reaction was documented years later. He lived directly across Prairie Avenue from the construction site. His mansion faced west. Every time he exited his front door, he saw Richardson's granite walls rising across the street. He watched the construction for 18 months, spring 1886 through December 1887. Every day the walls grew taller. Every day the fortress appearance became more pronounced. Every day it became clearer that this house was rejecting everything his mansion represented. Pullman told visitors, "I do not know what I have ever done to have that thing staring me in the face every time I go out of my door." The comment revealed everything. Pullman interpreted the blank walls as personal affront. The house was staring at him. The architecture was aggressive. The design was an attack. He was correct. Richardson had positioned the blank walls to face Pullman's mansion directly. The interior courtyard opened south, away from Pullman's property. The private family spaces had no relationship to Pullman's line of sight, but the public facade confronted him specifically. The architectural message was clear. Your mansion means nothing to us. Your ornament impresses no one here. Your wealth and status do not require our acknowledgement. We will turn our backs to you in granite. Pullman built a 3-story chateau meant to announce his importance. Richardson built blank walls that denied that importance. The confrontation was built into the stone. Other neighbors were less personally offended, but equally confused. The house made no sense in Prairie Avenue's architectural language. It refused to speak the vocabulary the street understood. The second floor had windows facing the street. These were tall, refined openings divided by mullions with finely carved capitals. They provided light to bedrooms and hallways. But the first floor, where public entertaining occurred in Victorian homes, remained blind to the street. The interior courtyard was the opposite. Large windows, French doors, abundant light from the south. The family spaces were warm and inviting, but that warmth faced away from public view. The street got granite. Construction completed in November 1887. The final cost was approximately $100,000. The Glessners moved in on December 1st, 1887. They had lived in their Washington Street house for the last time, the night before. They slept in the new house without regret about leaving behind something cozier. Francis Glessner recorded all the criticism and preserved it carefully. Years later, in 1923, John Glessner wrote his memoir of the house. He repeated every insult the neighbors had delivered. He was proud of the offense they had caused. The fortress was exactly what they wanted. The neighbors' disapproval confirmed they had succeeded in building something different. The blank walls would face Prairie Avenue for the next 138 years. The granite would outlast Pullman's mansion. The fortress would survive when the chateau was demolished. But in 1887, no one knew which house would endure. They only knew the Glessners had built something that insulted the street. Chapter 5. The Chateau That Demanded Attention. George Pullman paid between $350,000 and $500,000 for his Prairie Avenue mansion. The exact figure was never confirmed. He wanted uncertainty about the cost. It made people speculate about how much more he might have spent. The mansion was built in 1873. Pullman had purchased the lot at the northeast corner of Prairie Avenue and 18th Street for what was reported as the highest price ever paid for residential property in Chicago. The lot alone signaled his wealth. 4 men under age 40 designed and built the structure. Henry S. Jaffray was the architect. He had trained in the New York offices of Richard Morris Hunt, who designed mansions for the Vanderbilts and other Eastern aristocracy. Jaffray brought East Coast sophistication to Chicago's emerging elite. John Matthew Dunphy handled construction. Solon S. Beeman designed the interiors. Beeman had also trained under Hunt. He would later design the entire town of Pullman, the model company settlement that made his reputation. Nathan Franklin Barrett landscaped the grounds. The result was pure spectacle. 3 stories of gray stone. The style was described as reminiscent of the Grand Opera in Paris. Elaborate facades, towers and turrets, decorative stonework. Everything ornate and European. The architecture announced that the owner had money and wanted everyone to notice. The main entrance featured a porte cochere where carriages could deliver guests. A grand staircase dominated the entrance hall. The staircase was walnut. The balusters were hand-carved. Every detail was expensive. The first floor held the public rooms. A large drawing room ran along the south side. The walls were covered in silk damask. The ceiling featured elaborate plasterwork. Crystal chandeliers hung from medallions. The furnishings were French and Italian. Every piece was imported. A formal dining room seated 24. The table was mahogany. The chairs were upholstered in leather. A massive sideboard displayed silver. The room was designed for entertaining business associates and social equals. Pullman hosted dinners that lasted 4 hours, multiple courses, expensive wines, displays of wealth disguised as hospitality. The library held Pullman's book collection, first editions, leather bindings, books chosen for appearance rather than reading. The room announced cultivation. It suggested intellectual interests. The books remained largely unopened. A music room featured a piano no one in the family played professionally. But the room was necessary. Wealthy homes had music rooms. The Pullmans employed musicians for their parties. The second floor held family bedrooms. Pullman's chamber overlooked Prairie Avenue. His windows faced west. Every morning he looked across the street. After 1887, he saw granite walls. Private gardens surrounded the mansion. Lighted fountains provided evening displays. The fountains were gaslit. At night they created dramatic effects visible from the street. Passers-by stopped to watch. That was the point. A large conservatory grew exotic plants, orchids, palms, tropical flowers that couldn't survive Chicago winters. The conservatory required dedicated staff. A gardener worked full-time maintaining the plants. The expense was enormous. The display was worth it. The grounds were maintained by staff dedicated solely to landscaping. 3 men worked full-time on the gardens. They pruned, they planted, they maintained the lawns, they swept the walkways. The property had to look perfect. Inside, the rooms were designed for entertaining at scale. Multiple parlors, a grand dining room, a library, guest suites, every surface covered in expensive materials. The furnishings were imported. The art was European. The interior designers had created a stage set for demonstrating wealth. The house was forever ablaze with party lights. A journalist attending one gathering in 1880 gushed that the gardens of Kashmir were not more beautiful than the superb apartments of the Pullman residence, caught, as it seemed, in a shower of roses. The reporter described the fountains, the music, the elaborate floral arrangements. Every detail was cataloged to communicate to readers how much wealth Pullman possessed. The parties were strategic. Pullman used his mansion to establish social dominance. He invited Chicago's business leaders. He entertained Eastern investors. He hosted events that required reciprocation. The architecture was not just display. It was networking infrastructure. Railroad executives came to dinner. They discussed contracts. They negotiated routes. Business happened in the drawing room after the ladies retired. The mansion was Pullman's office as much as his home. In 1890, Beeman returned to expand the mansion. Pullman's daughter Harriet was engaged to Francis Carolyn, a San Francisco lawyer whose family had mining wealth. The wedding would be held in the mansion. The existing structure was not grand enough. Beeman added a dome, a new library, a billiards room, an enlarged drawing room. The expansion cost over $100,000. The addition made the mansion even more elaborate, even more European, even more explicitly expensive. The new drawing room could accommodate 200 guests. The ceiling was 20 feet high. The walls featured murals by imported artists. The room was designed specifically for Harriet's wedding reception. The wedding was held in 1892 in the new drawing room. 400 guests attended. The ceremony was Episcopal. The reception featured a 12-piece orchestra. The food was catered by Chicago's finest restaurant. The wedding cake was 4 feet tall. The presents filled an entire room. It was one of the last happy events the mansion would witness before Pullman's world collapsed. The mansion sat at 1729 South Prairie Avenue, directly across the street from where the Glessners would build. Pullman's graystone chateau faced west. His front windows looked directly at the lot Richardson would turn into blank granite walls. Everything about Pullman's mansion was designed to impress. The scale announced importance. The ornamentation demonstrated taste. The European references suggested cultivation. The cost indicated unlimited resources. Richardson's design would reject every single principle. Where Pullman built ornament, Richardson would use rough stone. Where Pullman created transparency, Richardson would build blank walls. Where Pullman invited public viewing, Richardson would turn inward to a private courtyard. Where Pullman announced wealth, Richardson would deny the street any information about the family inside. The two houses represented competing philosophies. Pullman believed architecture should advertise success. Richardson believed architecture should create privacy. Pullman built for his peers to admire. Richardson built for his clients to inhabit. The Glessners chose Richardson's philosophy. That choice was an implicit rejection of Pullman's. Every morning when Pullman left his mansion, he would see that rejection rendered in granite. His complaint that he did not know what he had done to deserve that thing staring at him was disingenuous. He knew exactly what he had done. He had built a monument to himself. The Glessners had built a response that said monuments meant nothing. The architectural confrontation was complete before labor violence made it seem prescient, before the Pullman strike made blank walls seem like practical protection, before Pullman became one of the most hated men in America. In 1887, Pullman was simply a rich man who built an expensive house. The Glessners were simply neighbors who built something different. The hatred would come later, but the insult was already delivered in stone. Chapter 6. The town Pullman owned. In 1880, George Pullman purchased 4,000 acres on Lake Calumet, south of Chicago. He built a town. He named it Pullman. He owned everything in it. The town was completed in 1881. Solon Beeman, who had designed the mansion's opulent interiors, designed the entire settlement. Red brick houses for workers, paved streets, landscaped parks, a train station, a library, a theater, a luxury hotel named for Pullman's daughter, Florence. The appearance was utopian. Neat rows of brick homes with small yards, trees lining the streets. Public amenities no working-class neighborhood could typically afford. Pullman presented the town as philanthropy, a model community that would elevate workers through environment. The reality was total control. Pullman owned every building. Workers lived in company housing. Rent was deducted directly from paychecks. The company owned the gas lines and charged for gas. It owned the water system and charged for water. It owned the library and charged an annual fee for access. Nothing was free. Everything generated profit. The houses came in different sizes based on worker rank. Skilled machinists got larger houses with 3 bedrooms. Unskilled laborers got smaller units with 2 bedrooms. Foremen got the best houses with front porches and small gardens. The housing itself reinforced the company hierarchy. A typical skilled worker paid $9 per month in rent. His house had running water, indoor plumbing, gas lighting. These were luxuries most Chicago working-class families couldn't afford, but the rent was higher than comparable housing in Chicago neighborhoods. Pullman justified this by noting the superior quality of his town. The workers had no choice about where to live if they wanted employment. The company town was required residence. The worker woke at 5:30 a.m. He walked to the factory, which sat at the center of town. Everything was within walking distance. The walk took 10 minutes. He entered through the factory gates at 6:00 a.m. He worked until 6:00 p.m. with a 30-minute lunch break. 12-hour days were standard. The lunch break meant walking home to eat. No time for anything else. Workers walked home, ate quickly, walked back. The town's compact design made this possible. It also meant workers never left Pullman property during the workday. At 6:00 p.m., the worker left the factory. He walked home. He had dinner with his family. Then he had choices. He could go to the library, which cost $3 per year to access. He could attend a performance at the theater, which charged admission. He could drink at the Hotel Florence's bar, the only place in town where alcohol was sold. Everything cost money. Everything generated revenue for the company. The rents were higher than comparable housing in Chicago. Pullman justified this by noting the superior quality of his town. The workers had no choice about where to live if they wanted employment. The company town was required residence. The charges consumed most of what workers earned: rent, utilities, library access, purchases from the company store, which was the only store in town. The deductions came out before workers received their pay. Many received almost nothing on payday. Pullman made profit on all of it. The town was not philanthropy. It was vertical integration applied to workers' lives. He controlled their labor, their housing, their utilities, their purchases, their leisure. Every aspect of their existence generated revenue for the company. The company store sold food, clothing, and household goods. Prices were higher than Chicago stores. Workers had no alternative. Leaving town to shop elsewhere required time they didn't have. The store extended credit that was deducted from paychecks. Workers went into debt to the company, while living in company housing and working in the company factory. His philosophy was simple. Workers who lived in beautiful, well-maintained environments would be more productive. They would not organize. They would not strike. They would appreciate the benevolence of their employer and work harder in gratitude. The philosophy worked until it didn't. In 1893, a financial panic devastated the American economy. The worst depression of the 19th century began. Railroads cut back on sleeping car orders. Travel declined. Demand for Pullman cars collapsed. Pullman responded by cutting wages. Workers earning $9.07 per two-week period saw their pay reduced by 30%. The new rate was approximately $6.35 per 2 weeks. Some cuts were deeper. Workers who had earned $12 per 2 weeks now earned $8. Pullman did not reduce rents. He did not reduce utility charges. He did not reduce prices at the company store. Workers' costs remained identical. Their income dropped by nearly a third. The rent was $9 per month. Workers earning $6.35 every 2 weeks paid $9 in rent monthly. After rent was deducted, they had approximately $3.70 per month for everything else: food, clothing, utilities, company store purchases, gas for lighting, water for drinking and washing. It was impossible to survive on $3.70 per month. Workers went into debt they borrowed from the company store. The debt accumulated. They fell behind on everything except rent, which was deducted before they received any money. Some workers received paychecks for 7 cents after all deductions. One worker's stub, preserved in union records, showed 2 cents remaining after 2 weeks of labor and rent. The worker had worked 60 hours and received enough money to buy a newspaper. The paychecks became famous. Union organizers circulated copies. The evidence was damning. Workers laboring full-time earned pennies while Pullman maintained rents and prices. Pullman explained that he was operating the factory at a loss to keep workers employed. He was absorbing the economic downturn to preserve their jobs. They should be grateful. The reduced wages were necessary for the company's survival. He never explained why, if the company was struggling, he did not reduce the rents or utility charges that were generating profit independent of the factory's losses. The town was profitable even when the factory wasn't. The housing, utilities, and store continued generating revenue. Pullman protected those profits while cutting wages. The workers understood. Pullman was protecting his own interests while claiming to protect theirs. He was maintaining profit from the town while cutting their wages. They were subsidizing his wealth. A committee of workers requested a meeting. They wanted to discuss preserving wage levels or reducing rents to match the cuts. They submitted a formal petition. The request was polite. The workers asked for negotiation, not confrontation. Pullman refused. He said the company had nothing to arbitrate. The wages were set according to economic conditions. The rents reflected property values. The two were separate. There was nothing to discuss. The committee members were fired the next day. Their employment was terminated. They were evicted from company housing. They had to leave the town. That was in May 1894. The workers had been living in Pullman's model town for 13 years. They had been controlled, monitored, and extracted from for more than a decade. They had paid premium rents while Pullman built a $500,000 mansion on Prairie Avenue. Now they were earning cents while Pullman refused to negotiate. Chapter 7. The Strike of 125,000 Sir. On May 11, 1894, 3,000 Pullman factory workers voted to strike. They threw down their tools and walked away from the assembly lines. The walkout was not spontaneous. The fired committee members had been organizers for the American Railway Union. The ARU was led by Eugene Debs, a 38-year-old union organizer who believed in worker solidarity across all railroad trades. The ARU had been recruiting Pullman workers for months. The union's message was simple. Pullman controlled everything in your life because you have no power individually. Organize collectively, and you become powerful. Together you can demand what you deserve. Apart, you have nothing. The union meetings were held in secret. Pullman prohibited union activity in the town. Workers who organized were fired and evicted. The ARU met in Chicago neighborhoods outside Pullman's control. The organizers were careful. They recruited slowly. They built membership one worker at a time. The 3,000 workers who struck represented approximately one-fifth of the Pullman factory workforce. The stoppage shut down production completely. Manufacturing a sleeping car required coordination across departments. Woodworkers built the frames, upholsterers installed seating, metal workers fabricated fixtures, painters finished the cars. If one department struck, nothing got built. Pullman claimed to be unscathed. He told reporters the company was operating normally despite the work stoppage. He refused to meet with strike representatives. He repeated his position. The company had nothing to arbitrate. There would be no negotiations. The workers knew local action would not force concessions. Pullman could wait them out. He had millions. They had nothing. A strike at one factory would fail. Workers would starve before Pullman felt financial pressure. They needed to disrupt Pullman's national operations. His sleeping cars ran on every major railroad. That meant stopping the trains. The ARU held its annual convention in Chicago in June 1894. The Pullman workers sent delegates. They described conditions in the town. They showed the paycheck stubs with 2-cent balances. They explained that Pullman was starving workers while maintaining luxury. The ARU voted to support the Pullman workers. On June 26, 1894, the Union declared a boycott. ARU members working for any railroad would refuse to handle Pullman sleeping cars. If a train included a Pullman car, ARU members would not operate it. Not as engineers, not as firemen, not as brakemen, not as switchmen. Within days, 125,000 railroad workers had joined the boycott. Trains stopped moving across the western United States. Mail service was disrupted. Freight sat in rail yards. Passenger service ceased. The scale shocked everyone. A local factory strike had become a national transportation shutdown. The boycott remained peaceful. No violence, no sabotage. Workers simply refused to move trains that included Pullman cars. If railroads removed the Pullman cars, the trains moved. If they didn't, the trains sat idle. Railroad executives demanded the federal government intervene. They claimed the boycott was interfering with mail delivery, which gave the government jurisdiction. Attorney General Richard Olney, who was a practicing railroad lawyer even while serving in the cabinet and was on the Pennsylvania Railroad's board of directors, declared the country had reached the ragged edge of anarchy. He obtained federal injunctions making the strike illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been designed to prevent corporate monopolies, but was now being used against labor unions. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to Chicago and other cities. Governor John Peter Altgeld of Illinois had not requested intervention. He said the state could handle the situation. Federal soldiers arrived anyway on July 4, 1894. The troops faced down strikers on July 4, 1894. Violence erupted. Mobs attacked railroad property. Hundreds of train cars were burned. Buildings were torched. Shots were fired. At least 34 people were killed. 13 died in Chicago. The rest died in other cities where federal troops confronted strikers. The actual death toll was probably higher. Many wounded were carried away by fellow protesters and never counted. Eugene Debs and other union leaders were arrested for defying the injunction. They were charged with conspiracy to interfere with the mail and interstate commerce. The trials were brief. The evidence was thin. Debs was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in Woodstock Jail in Illinois. The strike collapsed. By mid-July, workers began returning to their jobs. They returned on Pullman's terms. No wage increases, no rent reductions, no negotiations. The company took back workers who had not been identified as strike leaders. Known organizers were blacklisted. Throughout the strike, Pullman remained in his Prairie Avenue mansion. He watched the national crisis from behind his mansion's windows. He refused all requests for negotiation. Civic leaders begged him to meet with workers. Business associates suggested compromise would end the crisis. Pullman maintained his position, nothing to arbitrate. The Chicago Civic Federation organized a delegation, prominent businessmen who had no connection to labor organizing. They asked Pullman to negotiate. He refused to meet with them. He sent a written statement. The company's position would not change. Across the street, the Glessners watched the same events from behind their granite walls. The fortress that neighbors had called a paranoid overreaction suddenly seemed less unreasonable. Federal troops patrolling Chicago streets, mobs burning, railroad property, dozens dead. But the violence was not workers attacking mansions. It was a transportation boycott that railroad executives and federal authorities escalated into military confrontation. The blank walls facing Prairie Avenue protected against nothing that actually threatened the Glessners. Debs served 6 months in jail for defying the injunction. When he was released in November 1895, 100,000 people welcomed him at a Chicago reception. He was a hero to labor. The strike had failed. Debs had won. His imprisonment made him a national figure. He would run for president 5 times as a socialist candidate. Pullman received no welcome. His fellow industrialists were divided. Some supported his hardline position. Others thought he was a fool. Mark Hanna, a Republican political operative and industrialist, called him a goddamn fool for refusing to meet workers halfway. The general public blamed him for the violence and disruption. His reputation was destroyed. The man who built a model town was now famous for starving workers. The sleeping car magnate who claimed to be a benevolent employer was revealed as a despot who preferred military intervention to wage negotiation. In September 1894, Congress made Labor Day a federal holiday. The timing was obvious. Placate organized labor after federal troops killed dozens of workers. Give them a symbolic day while changing nothing structural. Labor Day was created to mollify workers, not honor them. In 1896, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that the Pullman Company must divest itself of the town of Pullman. A corporation could not own an entire municipality. The paternalistic experiment was declared un-American. Pullman was ordered to sell the housing and infrastructure. The model town would become a normal neighborhood. Pullman died on October 19, 1897, 3 years after the strike. He was 66 years old. He died in his Prairie Avenue mansion. His health had been ruined by stress. The strike and its aftermath had broken him. The man who controlled everything lost control of his own body. His family feared workers would desecrate his grave. He was buried at Graceland Cemetery in a lead-lined mahogany casket. The casket was covered in tar paper and asphalt. It was encased in concrete. Steel rails were laid over the concrete. More concrete was poured. The burial process took 2 days. The gravesite looked like a bunker. That much security was required for a man who claimed to have done nothing wrong. A man who believed he was benevolent. A man who built a model town that became a prison. Chapter 8. The Mansion's Different Fates. Prairie Avenue reached its peak around 1890. The street was called the Sunny Street that held the sifted few. Marshall Field lived there. Philip Armour, George Pullman, John Sherman, William Wallace Kimball. The concentration of wealth was extraordinary. By 1900, the decline had begun. Railroad tracks multiplied to the south and east. Soot from locomotives drifted across the mansions. Factories expanded closer to the residential blocks. The stockyards generated smoke and smell. The Vice District crept northward from 22nd Street. The Levee District, Chicago's red light area, operated blocks from Prairie Avenue. Brothels, gambling houses, saloons. The proximity had been tolerable when the entertainment was discreet. By 1900, the district was expanding and becoming less careful about boundaries. The proximity to industry and working-class neighborhoods had once been convenient. Businessmen could walk to their offices. The loop was close. The Chicago River did not need to be crossed. Men liked being near their factories and stockyards. They could supervise operations personally, but as Chicago's wealthy class grew larger, they wanted distance from where their wealth came from. They did not want to see factories. They did not want to smell stockyards. They did not want to encounter workers on their streets. The convenience became uncomfortable. Potter Palmer had built a mansion on Lakeshore Drive in 1882. The location had been swampy marshland. Palmer filled the land and created the Gold Coast. The north side offered lake views, clean air, and separation from industry. The elite began migrating north. Marshall Field built on Prairie Avenue in 1876. By 1905, he was building a new mansion on Lakeshore Drive. Philip Armour died in 1901. His family sold the Prairie Avenue mansion in 1904. The buyers were a Catholic organization that converted it to offices. By 1899, the Chicago Tribune noted that Prairie Avenue was undesirable to those for whom it was affordable and unaffordable to those for whom it was desirable. The street was caught in transition. too expensive for middle-class families, too industrial for the truly wealthy. By 1911, warehouses and factories dominated the area. The printing industry moved in. R.R. Donnelley built a massive plant nearby. Automobile manufacturing established operations in the vicinity. The residential character was gone. The mansions sat among industrial buildings. By 1920, only a few stubborn holdouts remained in the old mansions. Many properties had been converted to rooming houses. Others stood vacant. The great houses were too expensive to maintain and too large for modern use. Heating costs alone made them impractical. Servants were harder to find and more expensive to employ. Pullman's widow Harriet stayed in the mansion until her death in 1922. She lived there alone with servants in a house designed for entertaining hundreds. The parties were long over. The drawing room sat empty. The ballroom was never used. The mansion was a relic of a world that no longer existed. Harriet died in January 1922. Her will specified that the mansion be demolished. She did not want it converted to commercial use. She did not want it standing as a monument to her husband's reputation. The house had to be destroyed. In 1922, per Harriet's will, the Pullman mansion was demolished. Workers tore down the gray stone over the course of 3 months. They removed the dome Beeman had added in 1890. They destroyed the library, the billiards room, the drawing room where Harriet Pullman had married Francis Carolyn. The woodwork was salvaged and sold. The fixtures were removed. The private gardens were erased. The conservatory was removed. The fountains were turned off and dismantled. By 1929, no trace of the mansion remained. A visitor to the street noted that the lot was empty. He recalled the mansion had stood in its own private park with a palm house, conservatory, and picture gallery. All of it was gone. The lot was dirt and weeds. In 1941, a bus depot was built on the site. The location where Pullman had paid the highest price ever recorded for Chicago residential property became a depot for public transportation. Greyhound buses parked where the drawing room had held 400 wedding guests. The irony was noted by no one. By 1941, almost everyone who remembered the mansion was dead. The Glessner family had a different trajectory. John and Frances stayed in their house through Prairie Avenue's decline. They watched their neighbors leave. They watched the mansions around them fall vacant or convert to commercial use. They watched factories replace residences. They remained. The fortress design worked in ways Richardson never intended. As the neighborhood industrialized, the blank walls insulated the interior from the changing environment. The courtyard kept out the noise and soot. The house functioned perfectly as industry encroached. Frances died in 1932. She was 84 years old. She had lived in the house for 45 years. She died in her bedroom overlooking the courtyard. The room had been hers since December 1887. John died in 1936. He was 92 years old. He had occupied the house for 49 years. He was one of the last Prairie Avenue residents who remembered the street's glory years. He remembered when George Pullman lived across the street. He remembered the strike. He remembered when the street held the sifted few. In 1924, John had deeded the house to the Chicago chapter of the American Institute of Architects. The gift would take effect upon his death. The house was to be used for architecture and allied arts and sciences. It was to be known as Glessner House. John wanted the house preserved as an example of Richardson's genius. The AIA accepted the gift. Then they calculated the maintenance costs. The house was enormous. Heating bills during Chicago winters were staggering. Property taxes were substantial. During the Depression, the expenses were overwhelming. In 1937, the AIA returned the house to the Glessner family. They could not afford to keep it. The Glessner heirs didn't want it either. The house was too large, too expensive, too difficult to maintain. The neighborhood was industrial. The location was unmarketable. In 1938, the heirs deeded the house to the Armour Institute, the precursor to Illinois Institute of Technology. The institute accepted the gift. They needed space for research and offices. The house was free. The location didn't matter. In 1945, the institute leased the house to the Lithographic Technical Foundation. The foundation needed research space for the printing industry. The house was near the printing district. The rooms were large enough for equipment. The foundation moved in. They installed large printing presses in many of the rooms. They conducted research on lithography, offset printing, and color reproduction. The interior was modified, but the floor plan remained intact. The oak paneling was covered with wallboard. The William Morris wallpapers were painted over. The arts and crafts furnishings were removed and sold. In 1958, the foundation purchased the house from IIT. In 1965, they relocated to Pittsburgh. The printing industry was consolidating. Chicago was no longer the center. The foundation no longer needed the space. The house was offered for sale at $70,000. It sat on the market for months. No buyers appeared. The neighborhood was completely industrial. No one wanted a residential building in a warehouse district. The house was too large for single-family use, too expensive to maintain, too odd to convert easily to commercial space. The fortress design that had been radical in 1887 was merely inconvenient in 1965. The house was threatened with demolition. Prairie Avenue had lost most of its mansions. One more would make little difference. The lot was valuable. The building was worthless. A group of preservationists intervened. Architects Philip Johnson, Phyllis Lambert, Dirk Lohan, Ben Wees, and Harry Wees joined concerned citizens to save the house. Philip Johnson called it the most important house in the country to me. He loved Richardson's work. He believed the house was architecturally significant even if the neighborhood was gone. In 1966, they purchased the house for $35,000, less than the asking price. Less than John. Glessner had paid for the lot in 1885. The sellers were relieved to find anyone who would take it. The purchase created the Chicago Architecture Foundation. The organization that saved Glessner House became the city's primary architecture advocacy group. Preservation had begun with one building. It expanded to protect hundreds. The foundation would eventually advocate for saving entire neighborhoods. It all started with Richardson's fortress. In 1970, the house was designated a Chicago landmark. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places the same year. In 1976, it became a National Historic Landmark. The federal government recognized it as nationally significant. In 1971, it opened for public tours. Visitors could walk through the rooms Richardson designed. They could see the courtyard. They could understand what the Glessners wanted. The fortress survived. Pullman's Chateau became a bus depot, then parking lots for decades, then in 2000 was redeveloped with upmarket houses and a condo tower called Prairie District. The lot where he built his monument to himself now holds structures he would not recognize. Young professionals live in condominiums where Pullman's ballroom once stood. The house he called That Thing still stands at 1800 South Prairie Avenue. The blank granite walls still face the street. The fortress still protects privacy Richardson designed into the stone. The architectural confrontation ended when Pullman died. The building that outlasted him was the one built to insult him. Chapter 9. The workers who built Glessner House were not recorded by name. Braggville pink granite was quarried in Massachusetts. Workers cut the stone to specification. They loaded it onto rail cars. They transported it to Chicago. They unloaded it at the construction site. They laid the courses in horizontal patterns across the facade. Illinois dolomite for the foundation came from quarries in the state. Workers extracted the stone. They moved it to Prairie Avenue. They set the foundation that would support the granite walls. Common brick for the structural walls was manufactured locally. Workers fired the brick in kilns. They delivered it to the site. They laid the brick walls that the granite would cover. Workers mixed mortar. They shaped stone. They installed windows. They built the interior courtyard. They constructed the servants' corridor along the north side. They finished the rooms that would house the Glessner family. Construction lasted 18 months, May 1886 to December 1887. Workers labored through summer heat and winter cold. Chicago winters would have made construction brutal. Mortar freezes. Stone becomes difficult to work. Hands go numb. Accidents increase. No records document their wages. No payroll ledgers were preserved. The construction cost was recorded as approximately $100,000. How much of that went to labor versus materials is unknown. Victorian construction typically allocated 40 to 50% of costs to labor. That would suggest $40,000 to $50,000 paid to workers over 18 months. How many workers? How many days of work? How much per day? The records don't exist. No injury records survive. Construction was dangerous. Workers fell from scaffolding. Stone crushed limbs. Mortar burned skin. Tools slipped. Accidents killed. Whether anyone died building Glessner House is unknown because no one documented it. Workers who died on job sites were replaced. The construction continued. Deaths were not considered historically significant. The workers' names appear nowhere, not in the Glessner family papers, not in the architectural firm's records, not in newspaper accounts of the construction. They built the house and disappeared from the historical record. The same pattern repeated at the Pullman mansion. Workers built the Greystone Chateau in 1873. Their names were not recorded. The construction crew numbered in the dozens. They worked for months. They excavated the foundation. They laid brick. They installed stonework. They built the interior rooms. They landscaped the grounds. None were named. The 1890 expansion employed workers whose identities were not preserved. Solon Beeman's firm hired construction crews. The workers added the dome. They built the new library and billiards room. They expanded the drawing room. They worked for months. They were paid. They left. History forgot them. When the mansion was demolished in 1922, the demolition crew was not documented. Workers spent 3 months tearing down what other workers had spent months building. They removed granite. They salvaged woodwork. They dismantled fixtures. They cleared the lot. No one recorded who they were. The pattern extended to the town of Pullman. Workers built 1,800 red brick houses between 1880 and 1884. They constructed the Florence Hotel, the Arcade Building, the Market Hall, the Greenstone Church. They built an entire town in 4 years. Hundreds of workers, thousands of workdays, none named. The architects were documented. The owner was famous. The workers were erased. The 3,000 workers who struck on May 11, 1894, remain mostly unnamed. Union records documented some organizers. Eugene Debs was famous. A few strike leaders were identified in newspaper accounts. Thomas Heathcote, George Howard, Sylvester Kelleher. These men gave testimony. They spoke at rallies. Newspapers quoted them. The thousands who walked off the job were described as a mass, not as individuals. The 125,000 railroad workers who joined the boycott existed as a number. Labor historians have identified some union organizers. Most participants remain anonymous. They stopped trains. They disrupted the nation's transportation system. They changed American labor relations. History remembers the number. It does not remember their names. The 34 people killed during the strike violence were not all identified. Some bodies were never claimed. Some wounded died at home and were not counted. In official tolls, the actual death toll was likely higher but was never determined precisely. Who were they? What were their names? Where were they buried? The records are incomplete or non-existent. This erasure was systematic. Archives preserve certain categories of information: construction costs, property values, architectural drawings, owner correspondence, business records, tax assessments, legal documents. Archives did not preserve worker names, wages, or working conditions unless those details became legally relevant. Routine employment was not considered historically significant. Workers were inputs to production, not subjects worthy of documentation. The choice about what to preserve revealed priorities. Richardson's name was recorded because he was the architect. Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge were documented because they completed the work. The Glessners were extensively recorded because they owned the house. Their letters survived. Their journals were preserved. Their financial records were archived. The workers who actually built the structure left no trace. The granite remains. Every stone was cut and placed by human hands. The walls have stood for 138 years. The workers who built them have been forgotten for 138 years. Tourists who visit Glessner House today walk through rooms built by unnamed workers. They admire stone carved by anonymous masons. They photograph architecture created through labor that has been erased. The same tourists who visit Glessner House can visit Graceland Cemetery and see Pullman's grave. The monument is elaborate. It features a Corinthian column. The burial beneath required 2 days of work by laborers who placed the casket in concrete and steel. Workers who built the tomb, workers who filled the grave, workers who laid the concrete, workers who set the steel rails. Those workers were not named either. The pattern was identical across Gilded Age construction. Architects received credit, owners were documented, workers disappeared. That disappearance was not accidental. It reflected deliberate choices about whose contributions deserved preservation. Design was attributed to individuals. Construction was attributed to labor as a category. Capital documented itself. Labor was erased. The granite walls at 1800 South Prairie Avenue carry the marks of the tools that shaped them. Chisel marks on the rough-cut stone, saw marks on the cut edges. Each mark was made by a human hand holding a tool. The stone remembers what the archives do not. Chapter 10. The Legacy Tours Don't Mention. Today, tourists arrive at 1800 South Prairie Avenue. They pay admission. The 45-minute tour begins in the entrance hall. The guide explains that Henry Hobson Richardson designed the house in 1885 and 1886. The guide describes Richardson's Romanesque style, the rough-cut granite, the round arches, the interior courtyard that brings southern light into the family rooms. The tour proceeds through the house. The guide points out William Morris wallpapers, arts and crafts furnishings, the oak-paneled library, the dining room with its elaborate woodwork, the bedrooms where the Glessner children slept. Every detail is explained. The architectural significance is emphasized. The guide mentions that the house was controversial when it was built. Some neighbors did not understand the design. They called it a fortress. The guide explains this was Richardson's response to the urban environment. The blank walls provided privacy and protection. The courtyard is highlighted as the genius of the design. Southern light floods the family rooms. The space is intimate and warm. The contrast with the exterior is noted. Fortress outside, home inside. The guide emphasizes how well Richardson understood the client's desires. The tour acknowledges briefly that George Pullman lived across the street. The guide may mention that Pullman did not like the house. The quote about that thing sometimes appears in the tour narrative. The Hugh line gets a laugh from tourists. The fortress was so radical it offended the neighbors. Isn't that interesting? The tour does not explain what Pullman's mansion looked like. It does not compare the two architectural philosophies in detail. It does not explore why Pullman hated the house so intensely for 10 years. The confrontation is mentioned, but not analyzed. The tour mentions the Haymarket bombing. The guide notes the event occurred during the house's construction. The fortress design is sometimes attributed to fears about labor unrest. The Poor People's March is mentioned if the guide remembers it. The chronology is rarely examined closely. The guide moves visitors through the first floor. The entrance hall, with its low ceiling designed to make the courtyard feel more open. The drawing room with restored wallpaper. The dining room with the original woodwork. The music room where Francis played piano. Every room is examined. Every architectural detail is explained. But what the tours do not mention requires listing. The tours do not explain that Richardson designed the house before Haymarket. They do not note that the blank walls were already planned when the bomb exploded. They do not clarify that the fortress appearance was aesthetic choice, not security response. The timeline is mentioned vaguely, but not emphasized. The myth that labor violence inspired the design persists because correcting it requires uncomfortable questions. The tours do not detail the Pullman strike. They mention it in passing if a tourist asks. They do not explain that 3,000 workers walked off the job on May 11, 1894. They do not mention the boycott that grew to 125,000 railroad workers. They do not count the 34 dead. Federal troops, burned rail cars, Eugene Debs in jail. These facts are inconvenient. The tours do not compare Pullman's wages to the Glessner family's wealth. They do not note that Pullman workers earned 7 cents every 2 weeks after rent, while Pullman built a $500,000 mansion. They do not juxtapose the model town's utopian appearance with its economic reality. Pullman is mentioned as a neighbor. His business practices are not examined. The tours do not explain that Labor Day was created in September 1894 to placate workers after federal troops killed dozens during the strike. They do not discuss Eugene Debs or the American Railway Union. They do not examine how the Pullman strike changed American labor relations. These topics are too political for a house museum. The tours do not name the workers who built Glessner House. They do not explain why those names were not recorded. They do not discuss wage records or working conditions. They do not acknowledge that construction was dangerous and accidents occurred. The workers are invisible. The tours do not explain that the Pullman mansion was demolished in 1922. They might mention it if asked. They do not describe what stood on the lot afterward: bus depot, parking lots, modern condominiums. They do not note the irony that the house Pullman hated survived while his own became nothing. The tours do not explore Prairie Avenue's decline in detail. They mention that the neighborhood changed. They do not connect the street's abandonment to industrialization and the proximity to working-class neighborhoods that made wealthy families uncomfortable. The decline is presented as inevitable rather than as elite flight from industry. The tours do not examine what happened to the workers who struck. They do not discuss blacklisting or retaliation. They do not explain how the Pullman Company town was dismantled after the Illinois Supreme Court ruled against corporate ownership. The aftermath is erased. The tours do not discuss how much servants earned working in the house. They mention that the servants' quarters ran along the north side. They note that Richardson designed the house to buffer the family from noise. They do not discuss wages, hours, or working conditions for the people who cooked, cleaned, and maintained the fortress. These omissions are not accidents. They are choices about which history deserves emphasis. The tours celebrate architectural innovation. They highlight Richardson's genius. They admire the Glessner's sophisticated taste in furnishings and design. They present the house as triumph of American architecture. The fortress is beautiful. The courtyard is brilliant. The design is revolutionary. That narrative is accurate but incomplete. The house was an architectural triumph. It was also a deliberate insult to Victorian conformity, and specifically to George Pullman. The blank walls were both aesthetic statement and social confrontation. The design rejected the entire system Prairie Avenue represented. The tours preserve what makes donors comfortable. Wealthy patrons support historic house museums. They appreciate architecture and decorative arts. They donate money to preserve beautiful buildings. They serve on boards. They attend fundraisers. They do not appreciate labor history that frames their ancestors' wealth as exploitation. The Glessner House Museum receives funding from foundations and individual donors. The Chicago Architecture Foundation operates the property. The tours must balance historical accuracy with donor relations. Emphasizing the Pullman strike might alienate supporters. Focusing on architecture maintains broad appeal. Discussing worker erasure creates discomfort. Celebrating design creates beauty. This pattern repeats across Gilded Age house museums. The Vanderbilt estates in Newport emphasize architectural splendor. The Breakers, Marble House, Rose Cliff. The tours describe room dimensions and imported materials. They mention the cost of chandeliers. They do not discuss how Cornelius Vanderbilt built his railroad fortune or what he paid workers. The Rockefeller properties highlight conservation and philanthropy. John D. Rockefeller restored colonial Williamsburg. He donated land for national parks. The tours emphasize his generosity. They do not dwell on Standard Oil's monopolistic practices or the Ludlow Massacre, where Rockefeller's Colorado mine guards killed striking workers and their families. The Carnegie mansions focus on libraries and cultural giving. Andrew Carnegie funded 2,500 libraries. He believed in the gospel of wealth. The tours celebrate his philanthropy. They minimize the Homestead strike where Pinkerton agents killed workers at his steel plant. Labor exploitation is mentioned vaguely, if at all. The workers who built the mansions are not named. The strikes and violence that accompanied wealth accumulation are sanitized or omitted. The tours present wealth as benign, success as admirable, architecture as beautiful. The interpretive choice is economically rational. House museums operate on limited budgets. They need visitors. They need donors. They need positive relationships with wealthy supporters. Tours that celebrate beauty and achievement attract more support than tours that examine exploitation. Donors want to feel good about preserving history. They do not want to feel complicit in systems their ancestors built. But the choice creates incomplete history. It preserves architecture while erasing labor. It celebrates wealth while forgetting its costs. It makes the past beautiful by removing its ugliness. The house that George Pullman hated still stands on Prairie Avenue. The tours are excellent. The guides are knowledgeable. The restoration is meticulous. Every detail is explained. The architecture is preserved perfectly. But tourists photograph the granite walls without learning that Pullman died one of the most hated men in America. They admire the courtyard without learning that 34 people died because he refused to negotiate with workers earning 7 cents bi-weekly. They appreciate Richardson's genius without learning that his reputation was destroyed 3 years before his death. The architectural confrontation is preserved in stone. The labor violence is preserved in archives that tour guides do not cite. The workers who built both mansions are preserved nowhere except in the marks their tools left in granite. That pattern repeats across every Gilded Age estate in America. Celebrate the architecture. Marvel at the furnishings. Preserve the donor relationships. Sanitize the violence. Make wealth beautiful again. The fortress still faces the empty lot where Pullman's Chateau once stood. One house survived because preservationists recognized its architectural importance. The other was demolished because Harriet Pullman's will demanded it. Both houses were built the same way. Workers unnamed, labor erased, wealth documented. Exploitation sanitized, violence forgotten. The granite walls at 1800 South Prairie Avenue still turn their back to the street. They still reject Victorian display. They still insult conformity. But the deepest insult is not the one Richardson designed. It is the one the tours deliver. They celebrate the house while forgetting everyone who built it. They preserve the fortress while erasing the workers. They remember the wealthy family while forgetting the 7-cent paychecks. They honor the architect while ignoring the masons who cut every stone. That is the real dark story of Prairie Avenue. Not the blank walls, the blank archives where workers should be.